Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're cracking open an ancient text that, well, it reads almost like a mythic, graphic novel-style fable. But let me tell you, it carries a philosophical weight that is absolutely mind-blowing. We're looking at the story of the Seraph, a celestial entity, and we're going to explore this massive cosmic tension between absolute divine proximity and inherent nothingness. It's a deep dive into biblical philosophy, philology, and honestly, the very roots of existentialism and nihilism. So, let's jump right into this.
The terrifyingly thin boundary between absolute holiness and total alienation. Right off the bat, we are hit with this absolutely wild concept. What this source material reveals, and I think what makes it so fascinating, is that the capacity for supreme love carries the exact same mathematical weight as the capacity for supreme rebellion. They are literally two sides of the exact same coin. To reach the ultimate heights of spiritual devotion means you're standing right on the very edge of the deepest, darkest abyss.
Section 1. The Blazing Mirror, or the Furnace of Devotion.
Okay, so let's start at the very beginning of this sort of inverted hero's journey, right in the unmeasured wake of the first dawn. Imagine a place of just blinding light and unmediated fervor at the boundary of unapproachable light. To really understand this being, we've got to look at the language. The word seraphs comes from the Hebrew root seraph, which literally translates to burn, to consume, to reduce to ash. So this entity wasn't just some winged celestial guardian standing watch. No, it was a living furnace. Its entire existence was fueled entirely by the raw kinetic energy of divine holiness. It didn't just reflect light, it was a consuming fire, marking the exact boundary between the creator and the vacuum of the unmade.
And just look at how it existed. Its 6 wings formed this complex geometry of absolute surrender, where the act of flight was basically indistinguishable from the act of adoration. In this state of perpetual zeal, existential dread, that simply couldn't exist. Why? Well, because the entity's identity was completely externalized. It had this ontological blindness to itself. It was totally dissolved within the infinite echo of the Trisagion, that eternal declaration of the deity's threefold perfection. It poured literally every single ounce of its being into that unblinking focus.
Moving into Section 2, the knife edge of existence, the paradox of proximity.
Now, the crucial paradox of this existence is this. The closer a created being is to absolute being, the more acutely it feels the void of its own inherent nothingness. The seraph's existence wasn't peaceful or, passive. It was a violent, agonizing tension. Every single time it cried out holy, it was engaging in this intense act of cosmic friction. It was an existential negotiation where it willingly allowed its own individuality to be incinerated just to bridge the infinite void. It had to constantly give itself up to remain a consuming mirror.
You can actually visualize this psychological shift. Picture a consuming mirror of pure crimson light. That's the external identity, burning brightly for the creator. But then, a cooling begins, a shift toward a deep, heavy violet. That violet represents the internalized ego. It's almost like a dying ember caught between the light of heaven and the gathering darkness of self-determination. A really profound change is happening here within the entity.
Section 3, the philological fracture, a whisper of doubt. And this brings us to a catastrophic turning point. What's wild is that this fracture doesn't begin with malice or some grand, violent rebellion. Actually, it starts with just a whisper of doubt, a really subtle intellectual hesitation in the absolute stillness of eternity. The text points to a philological misinterpretation here. The entity looks inward and recognizes its own brilliance, referred to as Hallel, the morning star, the shining one. Fun fact, if you translate Hallel into Latin, you get the word Lucifer. But the entity makes a fatal error. It misinterprets this reflected grace as an intrinsic property. It thinks, wait, I am producing this light myself. And with that one thought, it begins to question its perpetual concealment, wondering why a being of such magnificent radiance has to forever hide its face and feet beneath its wings.
You can literally trace this psychological unraveling step by step. First, you have that unblinking focus on the external. Then, the fatal inward reflection. That leads to intellectual hesitation, questioning its whole role in the cosmos. And finally, an ontological collapse. The very wings that once shielded it in a geometry of surrender suddenly become these heavy sails, catching the wind of its own pride. The focus on the self breaks the entity entirely.
Section 4. An ontological collapse, the descent from Zophon.
This collapse triggers the descent from Zaphon, the sacred mountain of assembly. And we really have to understand ancient traditions didn't view this as merely a physical displacement. The seraph isn't just taking a trip from point A to point B in space. It is a fundamental collapse of its very being. The text states that an I am, independent of the ultimate I am, ruptures the harmony of the cosmos. The exact moment the entity claims a self, a separate existence completely divorced from the source of all life, the cosmos shatters. The ultimate heights of God's mountain literally become the site of the greatest potential exile.
Let's look at the before and after of this cosmic fire. Before the fall, the seraph was a burning purity, a singular flame warming the celestial courts and keeping the chaos of non-being at bay. But after the fall, it's completely stripped of its light, and what's left? A perpetual, unquenchable thirst, a dark, destructive heat of isolation. The light is gone for sure, but the immense scope of its energy remains, just twisting inward on itself. And honestly, that redefines our understanding of the descent entirely. This text argues that the fallen entity doesn't just drop into a physical pit of sulfur. No, it falls into the existential hell of its own memory. It's trapped forever, agonizingly conscious of the divine proximity it once had, and fully aware of the absolute nihilistic void it willfully chose to inhabit. Its punishment is entirely its own psychology.
Now you might be wondering, what does this all mean for us? How does the seraph's exile actually mirror our own modern ego? Because this isn't just some ancient fable. It's a deeply profound exploration of human isolation, self-worth, and the very real trap of self-centered thinking today.
Which brings us to Section 5, the modern wandering star, ego and exile.
Let's pull this allegory into the present moment for a second. In our modern world, we are constantly encouraged to look inward, right? To build up our own egos and to see ourselves as the absolute center of our universe. But supreme self-focus leads to the exact same ontological collapse we just explored. This stark philosophical warning echoes across time. The highest spiritual heights harbor the deepest psychological abysses. When we twist our devotion, our talents, or our potential into a tool for our own pride, we create our own exile. We basically trade the warmth of connection and purpose for a futile, nihilistic defiance, isolating ourselves in that exact same dark, destructive heat.
And that leaves us with this final, haunting metaphor to wrap up our explainer today. When a being of pure fire loses its connection to the light, it doesn't simply go out. It becomes a wandering star, trapped forever in the blackness of its own self-made exile. So if our own egos drive us to disconnect from the greater harmony of the world around us, we really have to ask ourselves, are we shining our own light, or are we just wandering in the dark we created? Something to think about. We'll see you next time.